Good morning. My name is Tom McHenry, and I have recently stepped down as Dean, but remain President and Dean Emeritus of Vermont Law School. Dean Beth McCormick started this week as our interim Dean. Many of you know her, and she's wildly busy, although hopes to be able to listen in on part of today's program. It is a tremendous honor and a pleasure to be able to open this session on the subject of race in the law, and particularly on the subject of voting in the Electoral College, which have been subjects of such vigorous debate in recent times. I want to thank Elijah and the other BALSA students for their organization of the program, and of course, Dean Jefferson for her support. You have a great speaker you're about to hear from for our keynote. Kendra Brown, who's a Vermont Law School graduate and has packed into the last decade since she graduated from Vermont Law School a lifetime of relevant experiences. You also have some absolutely terrific individual sessions over the course of the day, and I'm hoping to be able to listen into a number of them, featuring some of your faculty, your students here at the school, and some outside speakers with bring a wealth of experience to the subjects. I want to open this program on a hopeful note. I think we've all learned in the last year about the terrible status of race and law in America, and that it's not working, and that it's not just, and that it's not fair. But when I talk with Dean Shirley Jefferson about these issues, and I speak with students about their frustration and whether they're wondering if they should be out there demonstrating instead of going to law school or instead of getting a master's degree, I think Dean Jefferson and I agree when we say that if you care deeply about race and law in America, there is probably nothing more valuable and important that you can do right now than to go to law school, graduate quickly, and get out there and use the skills you've learned with your JD degree or with your master's policy degree in doing something to improve race and law in America. Our former president, Barack Obama, noted that the study of law can be, and this is from his book, Dreams of My Father, a sort of, and I quote from him, a sort of glorified accounting that serves to regulate the affairs of those who have power, and that all too often seeks to explain to those who do not the ultimate wisdom and justice of their condition. But President Obama also said, that's not all that law is. The law is also memory. The law also records a long-running conversation, a nation arguing with its own conscience. And I spoke yesterday on a panel with several other law deans, including the dean at Berkeley Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky, who said, in facing the same question about whether or not you should be in law school or whether or not you should be out there doing more to address race in the law, that law is arguably in America the most powerful instrument to address racial injustice. So stay with it. Stay with your studies, work hard, and graduate and go off to do good things. The most hopeful note I want to leave you with, and a subject that our speaker may want to touch on, is the fact that we have a new administration in Washington that has quite explicitly addressed the issue of racial equity. And on January 20th, which is literally just 10 days earlier, President Biden issued an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. Now, we know that we're not going to achieve racial equity solely through the efforts of the federal government, but we also know that it is a great and important starting point. And I'm going to read to you just a first couple of sentences from the policy in this executive order, because I think it is quite articulate. The policy in the executive order states, equal opportunity is the bedrock of American democracy, and our diversity is one of our country's greatest strengths. But for too many, the American dream remains out of reach. Entrenched disparities in our laws and public policies, I repeat that, entrenched disparities in our laws and public policies and in our public and private institutions have often denied that equal opportunity to individuals and communities. Our country faces converging economic, health, and climate crises that have exposed and exacerbated inequities, while a historic movement for justice has highlighted the unbearable human costs of systemic racism. Our nation deserves an ambitious, whole of government equity agenda that matches the scale of the opportunities and challenges that we face. I don't think there's any way it could have been said better and more succinctly. The executive order indicates that it will be the policy of the administration to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity. And by equity, they mean the consistent, and I'm quoting again from the executive order, the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, LGBTQ plus persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and we all know much of Vermont is rural, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. This executive order specifies the role of the Domestic Policy Council in addressing racism and trying to achieve equity. It directs the Office of Management and Budget to study methods for preventing, for putting down barriers to full and equal participation by all individuals. It requires an equity assessment in the federal agencies, the allocation of federal resources to advance fairness and opportunity, the promotion of equitable delivery of government benefits and other opportunities, and engagement with members of underserved communities. So we shall see how well that can be accomplished, but you can see that law and policy is absolutely central to doing this. So I'm thrilled that we are going to be spending so much time talking about and addressing these issues today, particularly in the context of voting. And I'm thrilled that our student groups, our Student Balsa group, put this program together. And I'm thrilled to see so many of our faculty and involved and outside expertise as well. So thank you very, very much. And I will turn it over to the introduction of our speaker by Diarra Raymond, who is a JD Marge, which is Masters of Restorative Justice, and the treasurer of the Black Law Students Association. Thank you. Diarra?
Thank you for those opening remarks, Dean McHenry. As Dean McHenry mentioned, this year's Race in the Law Symposium is focusing on systematic racism within America's voting system. We have a diverse array of speakers and panelists that we're excited to present to you, and they'll discuss how laws on voting on politics impacts people of color. We hope this symposium gives viewers a better idea of the avenues legal professionals can take to create a more equitable voting process for all Americans, regardless of their racial or ethnic background. Kendra Brown, our keynote speaker today, is currently the Director of Public Policy at Mastercard and the former National Chair of the National Black Law Students Association. Ms. Brown earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science with a minor in Business Management from Hampton University. Pursuing seminary studies, Ms. Brown took courses at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and completed her Master of Divinity at Howard University's Divinity School. Ms. Brown also received her law degree from Vermont Law School in 2012 and has a Master of Law degree from George Washington University School of Law. Throughout her professional career, Ms. Brown has worked to strengthen her community. She has previously served as Representative G.K. Butterfield's Chief of Staff in the United States House of Representatives, and she has also led diversity and inclusion initiatives at the Washington College of Law at American University as the Senior Director for Diversity, Inclusion, and Affinity. Ms. Brown has also served as Representative Dwight Evans of Philadelphia's Chief of Staff and Legislative Director, the Policy Director of the Congressional Black Caucus in the United States Congress, and Counsel for Representative Maxine Waters. Our keynote speaker today will be moderated by our Vice President, Robert Baker, and he will be asking her questions from the audience after her speech. Without further ado, I present to you Kendra Brown.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Diarra, for that kind introduction, and thank you also to Dean McHenry for the introduction as well to today's program. It's such a privilege and an honor to be with you, and I do, again, thank you for the invitation. I first want to say thank you to those who have helped me enter the profession as an individual who asks a lot of questions and also has a commitment to advocacy. I've always had a commitment to advocacy. That is the core of who I am. And when I tell people, even folks who I work with at Mastercard, that I went to Vermont Law School, the response is typically the same, but it's so cold up there. Yes, it was, but I enjoyed my time at Vermont Law School. And as I carry out my personal commitment to law for the community and for the world, I hold Vermont Law School very, very close in my heart. I want to first thank, of course, the leadership of the law school for ensuring that today's program was carried forth. Elijah Freeman and all of BALSA. I always have held a special place in my heart for the Black Law Students Association of Vermont Law School. They welcomed me on campus as well as the faculty and staff. And then, of course, as I went on to serve at the national level and still serve to this day on the advisory board of NABALSA. Thank you to all the students, to Ariel King, and the many students who comprise BALSA. And I look forward to the dialogue with Robert that will follow what I have to say. I would also like to personally thank Dean Shirley Jefferson for seeing something in me when I met her on the campus of Howard University years ago. I met her there and had the same response to her that others do now. Vermont, it's so cold, but the warmth of Dean Jefferson's spirit transcended even the coldest day in the state of Vermont, right? So I truly just want to say thank you, Dean J, as we affectionately call her, just for being who you are. We sincerely appreciate you. And also to Professor Mark Latham, thank you for consistently pushing me to be laser focused on issues. I sincerely appreciate you. And finally, it's my sincere honor to honor the memory of Dean Gil Kajovich, who saw something in me that I didn't even see at the time. He pushed me. He worked with me one-on-one to ensure that I understood how to think like a lawyer and showed me how to analyze issues in a way that helped others. It's as if he saw the work that I do now back then. And he was like a Sherpa to me, ensuring that I reached my destination. And so I truly honor his memory. I will forever be indebted to him. So race and the law, these are two areas that have always been intertwined in the American experience. As the 1619 Project so eloquently puts it, in August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the English colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. And no aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. I think it's important to start there as a reference point for the lived experience of those of African descent here in our nation who were brought here years ago. And there are a few areas that this has played out in that are of critical importance in our society. One is the economy. The second is in policing. The third is in voter disenfranchisement. And I know that our panel and panels later will speak to this specifically. And lastly, in equitable treatment. So first, in looking at the economy, the Brookings Institution finds a close examination of wealth in the United States. There's evidence of staggering racial disparities that exist even to this day. At $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family, $17,150 in 2016. Gaps in wealth between Black and white households reveal the effects of accumulated inequality and discrimination, as well as differences in power and opportunity that can be traced back to this nation's inception, as I stated earlier. The Black-white wealth gap reflects a society that has not and does not afford equality of opportunity to all its citizens. Efforts by Black Americans to build wealth can be traced back throughout American history, but these efforts have been impeded in a host of ways, beginning with 246 years of chattel slavery and followed by congressional mismanagement of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which left 61,144 depositors with losses of nearly $3 million in 1874, the violent massacre decimating Tulsa's Greenwood district in 1921. If you're not aware of that, please do look that up. A population of 10,000 that thrived as the epicenter of African-American business and culture, commonly referred to as Black Wall Street. And discriminatory policies throughout the 20th century, including the Jim Crow era's Black codes, strictly limiting opportunity in many Southern states, the GI Bill, the New Deal's Fair Labor Standards Acts, exemption of domestic agricultural and service occupations, and redlining. Wealth was taken from these communities before it had an opportunity to grow. So one can wonder why there have been persistent questions around the overall fairness of policies and practices in our nation towards Black people, and these policies and practices that have had a disparate impact on those in our nation who have been disenfranchised. One of the other areas that I mentioned was policing. In Ferguson, where we know Michael Brown was shot and killed, there was a U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division report that found the following. Ferguson's law enforcement practices at that time had been shaped up until then by the city's focus on revenue rather than by public safety needs. This emphasis on revenue compromised the institutional character of Ferguson's police department, contributing to a pattern of unconstitutional policing, and also shaped its municipal court, leading to procedures that raised due process concerns and inflict unnecessary harm on members of the Ferguson community. Further, Ferguson's police and municipal court practices both reflect and exacerbate existing racial bias, including racial stereotypes. Ferguson's own data established clear racial disparities that adversely impact African Americans. The evidence shows that discriminatory intent is part of the reason for these disparities. Over time, Ferguson's police and municipal court practices have sown deep mistrust between parts of the community and the police department, undermining law enforcement legitimacy among African Americans in particular. And this was in 2015. I advise you to go and read that report because it really outlines policies, right, and practices that were put in place and that were set forward that disenfranchised a particular community. right? And further exacerbated existing racial bias. And this is one example of many others that can be shown. And so I think it's important to show how policies impact communities that they are set forward to protect. So the city of Ferguson had a focus here on revenue rather than public safety needs. The third area of the four that I wanted to speak to is voter disenfranchisement, again, which I know that the panelists later are going to speak to also. As the Chief of Staff for Congressman G.K. Butterfield of North Carolina, when I was on the Hill, I had the task of just ensuring that we monitored what was happening at the state level as it related to practices that we saw there that were disenfranchising voters. There was even, and of course, this case went up to the Supreme Court, as you are aware, but there was even on the record a state legislator saying that they had drawn the districts in the redistricting to ensure a political advantage, right? And that they would have done more in that redistricting process to pack those districts if they could. He actually said that on the record. So it was clear the intent that they had to sow discord and to have a political advantage, which of course we call gerrymandering and which we know is unconstitutional. So these are things that are happening now, right? And we see what happened in the state of Georgia, where polls were closing. We see these things across the entire nation, where there is voter disenfranchisement that has continued. There's been misinformation that has been consistently sown. And so we know that anything that is powerful, right, is going to come under attack. And so knowing that the right to vote is one of the fundamental rights in our nation, yes, it came under attack, right? But we see that there were lawsuits filed by entities such as the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Advancement Project. These organizations filed lawsuits to protect the rights of individuals. And so just know that these are things that are still happening to this day. I'll speak to the administration, and I'm so glad that Dean McHenry shared that information as it relates to the specific focus on racial equity that the administration has. But just know that this is our nation. This is what we see to this day, and it's why it's so important that those who are in the legal field do all that they can to advocate for the rights that are to be protected, right? To advocate for communities. And so the fourth area that I stated that really needs to ensure that we have lawyers and those who are in the field of law fighting in is relative to inequitable treatment. There was, as we know, an attack on January the 6th at our nation's capital. And it showed us where the apparent inequities are that are still present in our nation. That this could actually happen in our country now underscore the inequities that have plagued our nation. And it seemed that this instance, when it seemed as if time stood still, it seemed as if everything that had happened leading up to this moment were really coming to bear. What would have happened if there were people who were attacking our capital who looked different, right? And we think back to when there were folks marching, and I was down there as well in Washington, D.C., ensuring that individuals knew that we were saying that Black Lives Matter, right? Not saying that others don't, but just knowing the historical inequities and the historical lived experience of Blacks in this country. It's not an attack on anyone, but it's just saying that we want equity too, right? And so I say that to say this inequitable treatment was shown in how the insurrectionists, right, were treated, and it's still showing to this day in some of the sentencing. So I won't go into that, but just know that, you know, I stood there watching on my screen, paralyzed by what I saw, and then I was frantically calling my former colleagues, my friends who I knew were in the office that day, who were in the building. It seemed that all hope was lost that day, but we saw that as the day moved forward, and there was, Metropolitan Police Department came in. We saw later in the day janitors cleaning the floors, the walls, the podiums that had been defiled. We saw Congressman Andy Kim, right, picking up the trash that had been left and helping to clean. We saw those who were elected to serve come back and do the work that they needed to do. They did the job of ensuring the inner functioning of our government and our democracy was literally put back together, putting those pieces back together so that our nation could proceed with the business of the day. I want to just share words that Amanda Gorman stated at the inauguration. And if you don't know her name, I would advise you to ensure that you read her poem that she read at the inauguration. She's our youngest poet laureate, right? And her reading was "The Hills We Climb." And some of the words that she shared are really necessary for this conversation for today. She said, and this is a short snippet, she said, "When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished." And I think that that is so important as we frame where we go from here as a nation. She goes on to say, "We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside." So what is our role? And I ask, what is all of our role? What are our roles in righting these things, these wrongs that have happened in our nation? What is our role in ensuring equity? What duty do we owe? And the answer comes in knowing that we are a resilient people. As law students and as individuals who are in the field of law, oftentimes, when we would read our cases and brief and share in class, oftentimes when we asked a question, the answer was, "It depends," right? And I charge you to always find an answer that lifts others. Find an answer that to that question, "It depends." Find an answer that will ensure that you are being the zealous advocate that you should be. The resilience of a people is shown in their ability to respond to situations of oppression and or opposition. There are inspirations, though, that I posit have served us along the way. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And Rosa Parks, if I could summarize her so eloquently, her answer was no. Maya Angelou stated, "I know why the caged bird sings." Shirley Chisholm said, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." Toni Morrison stated, "Freeing yourself was one thing. Claiming ownership of that freed self was another." Toni Morrison also said, "As you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think." W.E.B. Du Bois said, "The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression." So I come back to Amanda Gorman in her words. And she closed The Hills We Climb on Inauguration Day by saying, "We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. In every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn balloons as we free it. For there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it." So I charge you today to be that light, to be the canary in the coal mine, to push for right, to advocate for what is best, to speak to what is true, and to know that you can make a difference. For our administration to actually state and have a commitment to racial equity is amazing. We saw that in the transition review teams, in the agency review teams, as they were transitioning towards Inauguration Day, that they had layered racial equity even into the agency review teams. That was a specific called out lens. And so we have seen now a pivot to ensure that racial equity is something that is sought at every layers of our government. So the question is, what is needed? What can we do, right? There are those who legislate. There are those who march. There are those who write, those who search, those who question. But at the end of the day, we must all ensure that we are those who make a difference. And with that, I sincerely appreciate you allowing me the time to share my thoughts. I look forward to any questions that you may have. I think that Robert is going to moderate a dialogue, and any question at all that you have, please share. It is so important for us to know that we are called to make a difference, that law for the community and for the world means the world. Our nation is a part of this globe. And so it is our duty to ensure that we are a part of making this world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. And as mentioned by Diarra, I am the Vice President of BOSLA here at VLS. I first want to say thank you for your speech. It was very insightful and very educating. I'll start first with a question. In what ways can we address the negative stigma associated with efforts to educate the mass about how this economic disparity impacts voter suppression?
Absolutely. So I think that how you combat that stigma is to kind of understand what I said, the quote that Dr. King stated: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," right? Just because it's not happening in your state, it doesn't mean it's not happening somewhere else. And we are all connected. And we have to understand that we have a duty to our brothers and our sisters, right? To those in our nation who call this place their home. And we cannot let and allow systems that disenfranchise continue. We have to ensure that there is accountability, and we have to do what it takes within the mechanisms that are available to ensure accountability and to ensure that what is right can come forward. And if those mechanisms are not in place, then we speak with our legislators, we speak with our agencies, we speak with the administration about creating them. If you don't see something, then that just means it hasn't yet been created, which means there's still room for us to make changes and to make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you. This next question is more personal, on a personal note. After you received your master's, what would you consider to be your first win that made you confident that you were doing the right thing?
So I think, and I think you're referring to my master's of divinity. So my first win, I would say that after I entered law school, after my master's of divinity, I came back to be a fellow on the Hill one summer. And it was the summer that there was a oil rig explosion in the Gulf. And so I was working on that on the Hill, because the individual whose office I was in for this summer was on the House Judiciary Committee. And so I remember to this day that I had to call Professor Gardina to talk to her about what multi-district litigation was, right? I had to fully understand that. So that's where Civ Pro entered the scene, right? In my job in that summer, and it linked what I was doing in the classroom to the actual implementation of the laws that were written by Congress. And so I think that for me, it was a way to, really to know that I was doing exactly what I needed to do in that time, that I was in the right place, that I had come to law school at the time that I was needed to make a difference, right? So it was a full circle moment for me.
That's great. That's great to hear. This next question, and also viewers, please, you can feel free to write your questions in the chat or post to Facebook Live. Please do. This next question is a little bit long-winded. What advice would you give Black law students moving forward after witnessing the government blatantly treat those citizens differently as compared to Black Lives Matter? Is the law more important than the one enforcing it? Judges, for example, we witnessed an appointment of over 100 federal judges during the last administration. So is the law more important or the one enforcing it is the question.
So I think that the role of students, particularly Black students in the field of law, is of critical importance. The field of law needs you. We need you at every layer, right? We need you in the government. We need you in elected office. We need you as prosecutors. We need you as judges. And you can only attain and get to those roles by going on the path that you are on now. And so this field of law is so broad that I think that you have to ensure that you don't get weary. And I probably, I am a minister, so at some point I'm going to quote a piece of the Bible. There's a scripture that says not to get weary in well doing, for in due season you shall reap if you faint not. And so I say that to say and to encourage my fellow Black students not to get weary, that the field needs you. And don't get discouraged by what you see, because know that you are going to be in that field that you feel needs a change. And change happens best when it happens from the inside, right? There is pressure that can be asserted from the outside. And I shared that when I stated there are those who march, there are those who legislate, there are those who write, there are those who research. There are also those who sit as a judge, right? There are those who sit on the bench. There are those who are bringing charges in these courtrooms, right? There are Black lawyers needed at every single juncture of our legal system. And if there's ever a time where you are needed in the field of law, it is now. So I would just encourage you to know that the field needs you. It needs you desperately. And so do all that you can to be the student that you need to be so that you can be successful, so that you can get to the other side, right? As you graduate and as you enter the field of law.
Thank you so much. I guess I sparked a lot of questions. This next question is, how is the fight for voting rights different now than it was during the civil rights movement of the 1960s? What do you know about current efforts to protect or extend voting rights?
Absolutely. So I think that, so to the question, how is it different? I think that there are, at the fundamental root, right, there are still the same negative forces working to disenfranchise individuals who have an impact. We see what happened in the state of Georgia, right? Understanding with fair fight. And if you don't know about Stacey Abrams, I think you should really understand what happened in the state of Georgia when she lost. She turned that passion into registering over 800,000 people to register to vote, and not only in the state of Georgia, but nationally. And so we understand that there is power in the vote. And what we see are individuals, even at the state legislator level. We saw that in North Carolina. It is on the record. You can find it online. It is publicly available. We see that there are even state legislatures that have individuals serving in the legislature who act in a way that undermines and seeks to undermine that right to vote. That is real, and it's still happening to this day. So those same negative forces are still at play. We see the misinformation campaigns and things that have been put into motion. I know that and they don't only come, unfortunately, from America. They come from overseas, right? Because there are interests that are served when there is negativity and negative misinformation that is put into the atmosphere and into and really injected into our social media platforms. And we need to be aware of that. And I know that the social media companies have put into play, I know that Facebook now has, a civil rights division, right? And an oversight board, right? To ensure that what is on their platform is actually true and looks at the motivation of why the information is there also, and takes down those false profiles, right, that are bots that are seeking to spread this misinformation. And there have been hearings on this on Capitol Hill, and it's just a wealth of research in this area that really speaks to why this is still happening. And so I would say, again, that these negative influences are the same type of influences that sought to counter individuals actually exercising their right to vote. But at the end of the day, there are individuals who want to influence what happens at the top levels of government, and that's why there are these very coordinated efforts to disenfranchise.
Thank you for your answer and your response, Ms. Brown. This next question, I'm going to give you a little forewarning. Someone's done a little research. You shared staggering info. Wealth in Black families versus non-Black. Given the average American carries $6,000 and $6,200 in credit card debt. What policies is Mastercard working on to address that wealth gap?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you asked that question. We have set priorities within our company. And if you look, we have a solidarity commitment that we issued last June that states our commitment to priorities that specifically speak to communities of color and Black communities, but also we have our Center for Inclusive Growth does a significant amount of work with small businesses, helping to build small businesses to really look at how we can be a economic inclusivity influencer. We have financial literacy programs that we partnered with the National Urban League on, the National Action Network also, and members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and our inclusion efforts do also include our financial literacy for young people as well, to ensure that individuals understand how to be financially fit and how to really grow wealth. And so those are some of the ways that we as a company, as Mastercard, have really been committed to economic empowerment. Specific policies, we of course advocate for digital ID. We sought to ensure that disbursements that came from the stimulus checks actually went to and were received by underserved communities. We specifically advocated for that. We seek to always ensure that CDFIs, community development financial institutions, have the adequate amount of funding at the federal level, and we seek ways to ensure that we are helping to bolster those. So those are just some of the ways. I handle a lot of our third-party engagement with outside groups, such as the civil rights groups, and so they hold us accountable as well. And it's not me just sharing what we do, but there is an accountability there that is consistent. So that's what we are.
Well, I'll say you definitely nipped that question in the bud. Another question, based on your experience in Washington, how do representatives typically approach initiatives to make voting laws more equitable? How often do these initiatives become a reality? How can legal professionals advocate for these changes? So if you would like me to repeat the first question first, I would. I know it was layered.
Just the beginning. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Based on your experience in Washington, how do representatives typically approach initiatives to make voting laws more equitable?
Awesome, thank you. So interestingly enough, at the federal level, there is not one entity that oversees voting law, right? Because it's not federalized. It is a notion of each state. So I think that folks have to really be aware that as it relates to voting law, those are matters that are handled at the state level. That's why when the redistricting happens, the state legislatures draw those maps, right? That happens at a state level. The states have boards of electors, and the Secretary of State of each state has oversight of the election in that state. And so I think that folks don't always understand that it is a function of the state. So when things happen that negatively affect or have a negative effect on the election process, then the redress has to be sought at the state level. And I'm going to give you an example of this. I didn't want to mention this, but I'm just going to say it. A couple of weeks ago, right, when there was a call that a certain president made, right, that he had, it was a call with the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia, because that's where the election, right? That's where the oversight of the election is held. And so just using that as an example as to how we all know that the election oversight happens at the state level. So what can legislators do at the federal level? The House Administration Committee has a election subcommittee, and they set rules for what happens in the instance that there is that there is something that happens that needs to be addressed from a federal level, but oversight of elections happens and is a function of the state. So when those lawsuits come, they are filed against the state. So I would encourage those who are interested in working in this area and looking to see what they can do to speak with folks such as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Advancement Project, the Brennan Center for Justice, the ACLU. These are all entities who are doing work on voting and elections. Fair Count, that's Stacey Abrams' organization. These are all organizations and entities who are doing work to ensure fair elections are actually set forward.
Thank you for that instruction, because that definitely covered how could we and other legal professionals advocate for these changes. Seeking out those organizations would be a great first step. Thank you for that. Another question is posed, as it relates to voting and politics, did anything in particular stand out to you during the election? For example, news coverage regarding voter access or suppression that particularly raised your concern? Does anything come to mind?
As it relates to any type of suppression or coverage overall?
Yes. Was there any during the course of the election campaigns, was there any news coverage regarding voting access or suppression that particularly comes to mind or raised your concerns back then?
Oh, sure. And thank you for that. So I think that one thing that was a moving target, again, since every state does have oversight, all of the rules are different, and when they close polling areas, that can vary from state to state. And so individuals also knowing when the deadlines are for their absentee ballots, that can be a moving target in this state. And again, I keep coming back to North Carolina, and I always said that there's going to be a case study of what happened over the past few years on North Carolina, and it can just be called North Carolina, right? In the state of North Carolina, there was a call for people to vote in person and also send in absentee ballots. You cannot vote twice. It is illegal, right? And so knowing that and seeing that, really seeing for that to be actually implemented and calling for people to do that, that actually happened from a leader, right? And those types of things are ways that voter disenfranchisement is still happening to this day. And so I think that those ways that people are seeking to dilute the integrity of the election process, those are some of the things that really raised, my concern about what was happening at state levels throughout the entire process. And so now, on this side of the election, I know that there are many conversations happening at the state level to ensure that the integrity of the elections is ensured as we move forward in the next months and into the next set of elections. But I would just say that just knowing that there were mixed messages and not clarity by voters, especially given COVID-19. I haven't mentioned COVID-19 yet, especially given the procedures that had to come into play because we are in this pandemic. It was very, very hard for folks to really understand what to do and ensure that they were safe, if they were standing in the lines. So I think that, and I'm sorry I'm answering the question in a roundabout way, but I think that there was a lot that happened leading up to these elections, this iteration, that was extremely troubling.
No, please. Thank you for answering the question. It was definitely informative. And I have another question relating to this topic. What are your thoughts on state level initiatives to allow automatic voter registration, and what can be done to increase smaller election turnout?
When you say smaller election turnout or smarter?
I, I guess that would say, and well, what comes to mind for me is local elections, just within
Oh, I
county
see.
elections,
Okay,
for
at that,
example.
yes, localized. Yes. Okay, so thank you. I think that automatic voter registration. I know that happens, in a few states. I think that is something that should be considered at the state level, and there must be conversations about what is going to work best for that state. And so I really, it is my hope that there are conversations that are happening within each state, with stakeholders in the community, with community leaders at the table, to ensure that their voices are heard, so that the state legislatures can really do what is in the best interest of those who they govern. I think that people have to understand that you can not only vote if it's a year that there is a president on the ballot. It is important to vote at every instance, every time that you are able to vote, whether it is a judicial election, the school board. The school board is extremely important, and really has oversight over our children and how those funds are expended and how the education is set forward. And so I would really encourage everyone to really get to know what is happening in your local area, so that you are having a seat at the table, and you take that seat at the table first by casting your vote, by knowing who the candidates are, what their issues are, by participating in forums that they have, so that you can actually raise your virtual hand, right, and ask a question. So I think that there are ways now that we are able to interact virtually that we may not have, had an opportunity to in the past. And so I would really charge everyone to ensure that you are paying attention to when these conversations are happening. I happen to also, and I don't think I put this in my bio, I serve as the Maryland State Advisory Committee Chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And so that's a volunteer capacity, and that predated my time here at Mastercard. And so what we do there, within that commission and the State Advisory Committee, we monitor what's happening at the state level. And then if there are issues that we feel rise to ensure that we are, researching what is happening, and maybe issuing a memorandum of concern, like a statement of concern, then we do that. And we bring those issues really to bear. But I think that people have to understand that every time that you are able to vote, you must vote. And you have to know the candidates, know what their issues are, know what their priorities are, see how they align with yours or not, and ask those very hard questions so that they can be on the record stating what their positions are.
Right, and they call that grassroots movement, right?
That's right.
This next question is in the area of estate planning. So just to get your mind framed for this one, how do we
Where's Professor
address?
Wilbanks?
Oh, yeah, she's still there.
Uh-huh.
How do we address estate planning and wealth transfers and probates of POC to make the process easier, less expensive, and less combative, so there is more wealth that makes it to the next generation?
That is a absolute excellent question, and I think that what we are finding now, and I appreciate that question, because as I was speaking to the economy, right, and the racial wealth gap, estate planning is a critical component of that, in passing on wealth to the next generation, right? Wealth begets wealth, right? And I think that it is critical for there to be an increase in conversations around estate planning in uh, communities of color, because now you have more individuals, I would say, who have the who really are looking to ensure that, stock options, et cetera, whatever it may be, are passed on to their children and so forth. But even through the work that we do of our financial literacy programs, we are trying to not only ensure that everyone manages their funds well, but has capital to actually do that. And that's done through legislation. I know that Senator Cory Booker has set forward baby bond legislation, right? So there are a lot of different priorities that are able to be set forward at a legislative level. And historically, the Black community did not have wealth, right? And that goes back to the 1619 conversation, right? And so when we look at these historical inequities that have persisted, the obtaining of wealth was one of the key barriers to the Black community and to people of color. And so I think that as those numbers of the average income of Black households and people of color, as that increases, you have to have a corollary conversation about estate planning and how to pass on wealth and how to ensure that your finances and your investments are working for you, and that you're managing them well, and leaving money and funds and wealth for your children.
Thank you. It gave me something to think about myself.
There you go.
This next question is dealing with Mastercard. What will it take for a corporation or corporations such as Mastercard to become a B corporation, shifting its focus and responsibility from GDP growth to its impact on the communities in which they occupy?
So thank you for that question. And I'll, speak to work that we do. We have Center for Inclusive Growth, which is our arm of specific impact philanthropic efforts, right? And so I would ask the individual who asked that question to look at the Center for Inclusive Growth's work. We do a significant amount of work that is specific to impact through the Center for Inclusive Growth. Those are issue areas and priorities that are also set forth in the programming of our public policy team, of which I sit, right? I sit on our public policy team. And so for us, as I was sharing earlier, we have within our core set of priorities, looking at how we positively impact communities where we are. And of course, we are a global community. We are a global company, right? So I would just say that our work specifically on how we impact the society is done in a few different paths in many of our work streams and many of the things that we set forward. But specifically within our Center for Inclusive Growth, a lot of our impact work is done through that arm. So I would ask that if you have any other questions, if you look there, but please contact me if you have any additional questions.
I think that was a great answer and great instructions moving forward. As we close, because of the questions, I have one of my own for you. What's next for you, Ms. Brown? Is it Mastercard until, what's next? And what type of other initiatives are you doing that we might not be aware of?
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that question. And I love the work that I do within public policy. I think that for me, it goes back, and I say this often, to the core mantra that I live by is to make a difference as often as I can in the lives of as many as I can. And for me, that is what I'm doing now in the role that I have, any role that I have had that has always been my goal. So I'll always ensure that whatever I am doing is it is a role where I can positively impact people, can positively impact communities. And that's why I appreciate that last question, because it really, the work that I do helps me to have an impact. And I was a part in the fall of an inaugural program at Mastercard called the Racial Justice Pro Bono Project. And all of us who were a part of the program, there were 13 of us, we had to volunteer. It was an extensive interview process for us to be selected. And I was one of the 13. And in this particular initiative, we were matched with 3 nonprofits who have the goal of helping the community. And the nonprofit that I was matched with was the Diarra Center for Justice of New Orleans. And I'm going to show you how the Balsa connections are woven throughout all that we do. The head of that office, and I didn't even realize this at the time until after we had our statement of work from them, but the head of their office was someone I served on a Balsa board with while I was in law school. And so that just shows that everything is connected, right? And so for me, living a life of impact means I will always have a role where I'm really ensuring that I am helping communities. And oftentimes it will come full circle, just like it did.
That's wonderful to hear. And again, on behalf of the entire organization, I want to say thank you for speaking for us today and for educating us and informing us of what is essential to our democracy: voting, having your voice heard. With that being said, this concludes our presentation of Ms. Kendra Brown and her speech. Please take a break, and we'll see you back here for panel number 1.
Great. Thank you, Robert. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.